Chapter 1. An Unexpected Discovery at Primrose Hall. The annual garden party at Primrose Hall was always the highlight of St. Mary Mead's social calendar. Lady Amelia Montgomery had hosted it faithfully for 30 years, and at 72 she showed no signs of relinquishing her role as the village's premier hostess. The gardens of Primrose Hall were legendary. 5 acres of meticulously maintained flower beds, topiaries, and hidden nooks separated from the surrounding countryside by a high stone wall with wrought iron gates that remained locked except on special occasions. Miss Jane Marple had arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, as indicated on the cream-coloured invitation card that had been delivered to her cottage the previous week. She wore a light summer dress with a pattern of small blue flowers, and carried her favourite straw hat to shield herself from the afternoon sun. Despite her 80-odd years, she moved with surprising agility, pausing only occasionally to rest on one of the many benches scattered throughout Lady Montgomery's gardens. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you," called Mrs. Dolly Bantry, waving enthusiastically from near the refreshment table. "Do come and join us. Reverend Hawthorne was just telling the most amusing story about his new housekeeper." Miss Marple smiled and made her way toward the small group, which included not only Mrs. Bantry and the vicar, but also Dr. Edwin Carraway, the village's newest resident, who had taken over the practice when old Dr. Haydock finally retired, and Miss Letitia Blacklock, whose perpetually sour expression belied her generous nature. "Miss Marple," said Dr. Carraway, rising politely as she approached, "I've heard so much about you. They say you're something of a local detective." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple with a self-deprecating smile. "People do exaggerate so. I merely observe, you know. Human nature is remarkably consistent once you've had enough practice watching it." "Don't let her modesty fool you," Mrs. Bantry said, passing Miss Marple a cup of tea. "She's solved more puzzles than Scotland Yard." Reverend Hawthorne chuckled. "Indeed, and all without leaving the village for the most part." The conversation drifted pleasantly, touching on the topic of Lady Montgomery's rare roses, which were to be the highlight of the afternoon's tour. The garden's locked section, known locally as the Secret Garden, contained specimens that had won numerous awards at the Royal Horticultural Society's competitions. "I hear the new variety she's developed is to be named after the Queen," Miss Blacklock remarked. "Quite an honour. Lady Montgomery deserves it," said Dr. Carraway. "She's worked on that particular crossbreed for nearly a decade, from what I understand." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "It's more than that, I believe. Her roses are her legacy. Having no children of her own, Lady Montgomery has poured all her maternal instincts into her gardens." The observation caused a momentary lull in the conversation, as often happened when Miss Marple made one of her quietly perceptive comments. It was Mrs. Bantry who finally broke the silence. "Speaking of Lady Montgomery, I wonder where our hostess has disappeared to. She's usually so attentive to her guests. Indeed, it was unusual for Lady Montgomery to be absent during her own garden party." Miss Marple glanced around the assembled guests, about 30 in all, representing the upper echelon of St. Mary Mead society, along with a few visitors from neighbouring villages and London. Among the unfamiliar faces was a strikingly handsome young man, deep in conversation with Lady Montgomery's companion, Miss Flora Jenkins. Miss Marple observed them with interest, noting the intensity of their exchange and the way Miss Jenkins kept glancing nervously toward the house. "That's Peter Carmichael," Reverend Hawthorne supplied, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Lady Montgomery's grandnephew. Arrived from London yesterday, I believe. First time he's been back to St. Mary Mead in years. Quite the prodigal's return," added Miss Blacklock with a sniff. "I remember when he left. Caused quite the scandal with that business about the missing silver." Dr. Carroway looked confused. "Missing silver?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, it was all hushed up, of course. But several valuable pieces disappeared from Primrose Hall around the time young Peter went off to London. Nothing was ever proven, mind you, but the timing was suggestive. I always thought it rather sad," Miss Marple commented, her pale blue eyes still fixed on the young man. "He resembles his grandfather remarkably, Lady Montgomery's brother. The same proud bearing, and that distinctive cleft in the chin. Clock in the village church struck 4, and still there was no sign of Lady Montgomery for the promised tour of the secret garden." "Perhaps she's been delayed by some household matter," suggested Reverend Hawthorne. But Miss Jenkins had now excused herself from Peter Carmichael's company, and was hurrying toward the house with a worried expression. Miss Marple noticed that the young man watched her go with an inscrutable look before turning to join another group of guests. "I think I'll just stretch my legs a bit," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "The hydrangeas near the wall look particularly lovely this year." She made her way slowly along the gravel path, pausing now and then as if to admire a plant or flower, but her eyes were keen and missed nothing. She observed Peter Carmichael now speaking with Lady Montgomery's gardener, an elderly man named Stevens, who had tended the grounds for almost 40 years. Their conversation appeared tense, with Stevens shaking his head firmly about something. As Miss Marple approached the high wall that separated the main gardens from the secret garden, she noticed that one of the wrought-iron gates stood slightly ajar. Most unusual, as Lady Montgomery kept them locked at all times except during guided tours. A sudden scream shattered the genteel atmosphere of the garden party. It came from within the secret garden, and Miss Marple recognized the voice as belonging to Miss Jenkins. Without hesitation, she hurried toward the gate, arriving just as several other guests converged on the spot. Inside, they found a scene of horror that would forever alter the peaceful fabric of St. Mary Mead. Lady Montgomery lay face down among her prized roses, the earth beneath her stained dark with blood. Beside her, Miss Jenkins stood trembling, a pair of garden shears fallen. At her feet, "She's dead," the companion whispered. "Lady Montgomery is dead." And as the panicked murmurs spread among the shocked guests, only Miss Marple noticed the single, crucial detail. The key to the garden gate was still in Lady Montgomery's pocket, yet somehow the locked garden had been entered, and a killer had escaped, leaving no footprints on the freshly raked gravel path. Chapter 2. The Garden Gate. Mystery. Inspector James Craddock arrived at Primrose Hall within 30 minutes of being summoned. At 45, he was a seasoned detective with the county police, and had encountered Miss Marple during previous investigations. While some of his colleagues dismissed the elderly spinster's insights, Craddock had learned to value her quiet observations. "So, it appears we have a locked garden mystery," he said, surveying the scene as Dr. Carroway examined the body. The guests had been shepherded back to the main lawn, where constables were taking preliminary statements. Lady Montgomery was stabbed with these garden shears, Dr. Carroway reported, pointing to the bloodied tool. From the positioning and nature of the wounds, I'd say she was attacked from behind, with considerable force. Death would have been almost instantaneous. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain due to her discovery of the body alongside Miss Jenkins, studied the ground around Lady Montgomery. "Inspector," she said softly, "have you noticed the roses?" Craddock looked where she indicated. Several prize specimens had been cut, not carelessly damaged in a struggle, but deliberately and precisely snipped. "Someone took cuttings," Miss Marple continued, "before or after they killed poor Lady Montgomery." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "Interesting observation. A theft motive, perhaps?" Miss Jenkins, who had been seated on a nearby bench after her shocking discovery, spoke up. Lady Amelia would never have allowed anyone to take cuttings. Those roses were her life's work, especially the new Queen Elizabeth variety. She was planning to register it next month. "Valuable, were they?" Craddock asked. "Immensely," Miss Jenkins replied. "A new rose variety can be worth thousands, even hundreds of thousands to the right buyer. Lady Montgomery had already refused several offers." The inspector turned his attention to the garden gate. "The key was found in Lady Montgomery's pocket, you say, and the gate was locked when you arrived?" "Not locked, Inspector," Miss Marple corrected gently. "It was ajar. Most unusual, according to what everyone says about Lady Montgomery's habits. Who else had keys to this garden?" "Only Stevens, the head gardener," Miss Jenkins said, "and Lady Montgomery kept hers with her at all times." Craddock dispatched a constable to locate Stevens, then turned his attention back to Miss Jenkins. "Tell me about the last time you saw Lady Montgomery alive." "It was shortly before 4. She said she needed to check on something in the secret garden before the scheduled tour. She seemed agitated." "Agitated? About what?" Miss Jenkins hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure. She'd been on edge since her grandnephew Peter arrived yesterday. They had a rather heated discussion this morning in the library." "Do you know what about?" "Money, I believe. Peter's affairs are apparently in some disorder. He asked for an advance on his inheritance, but Lady Montgomery refused." Inspector Craddock made a note. "And where is Mr. Carmichael now?" "He was speaking with guests when I found—" Miss Jenkins gestured weakly toward the body, now being photographed by police technicians. As they talked, Stevens arrived, his weathered face pale with shock. "I can't believe it," he kept muttering. "Not Lady Montgomery." "Your key to the garden, Mr. Stevens," Craddock said. "Where is it?" The old gardener patted his pockets frantically. "It should be here, sir. I always keep it on me." "But it's not there now?" Stevens shook his head, distress evident in his rheumy eyes. "I had it this morning when I was tending the roses. I must have—" He trailed off, looking around helplessly. "When did you last see it?" Craddock pressed. I can't rightly say. I was talking to young Mr. Carmichael earlier. He was asking about the roses, particularly interested in the new variety." Miss Marple, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "Excuse me, Inspector, but I couldn't help noticing the gate's lock." Craddock followed her to the wrought-iron gate. "What about it?" "See how the keyhole has these tiny scratches?" She pointed with a knitting-needle-thin finger. "Quite fresh, I believe." The inspector bent to examine the lock more closely. "You think someone picked it? Or tried to, Miss Marple suggested. Perhaps they were interrupted and had to find another way in or out. Back on the main lawn, the guests waited nervously. Miss Marple observed Peter Carmichael standing apart from the others, smoking intensely. Nearby, Reverend Hawthorne comforted a weeping Mrs. Bantry, while Miss Blacklock engaged in hushed conversation with a woman Miss Marple didn't recognise. "That's Henrietta Simmons," Miss Jenkins supplied, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Lady Montgomery's solicitor. She arrived just before the party began. They spent nearly an hour in the study together." "Discussing her will, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested. "Very likely. Lady Montgomery mentioned making some changes recently." As Miss Jenkins spoke, Inspector Craddock approached Peter Carmichael. Their conversation, though inaudible from where Miss Marple stood, appeared increasingly tense. Peter gesticulated emphatically, his handsome face flushed with emotion. "I suppose Mr. Carmichael stands to inherit Primrose Hall," Miss Marple remarked casually. Miss Jenkins nodded. "He's Lady Montgomery's only living relative, though she was considering leaving a substantial portion to the Royal Horticultural Society instead. Recently considering this, was she? Yes, after Peter's last visit at Christmas. They argued terribly. She told me afterward that he was too irresponsible to be trusted with the estate." Miss Marple watched as Peter broke away from Inspector Craddock and strode toward the house, plainly agitated. The inspector didn't stop him, but made a subtle gesture to a constable, who followed discreetly. "Miss Jenkins," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "you mentioned Lady Montgomery was agitated before she went to the secret garden. Did she say anything specific?" The companion frowned. "She mentioned something odd. She said, 'Some secrets can't stay buried forever, Flora.' Then she took her garden shears and went to check on her roses." As dusk began to fall over Primrose Hall, casting long shadows across the once festive garden, Miss Marple noticed Stevens. Slipping quietly toward the gardener's cottage, something clutched in his gnarled hand. Following her gaze, Inspector Craddock dispatched another constable to intercept him. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been irreversibly altered, and as Miss Marple prepared to return to her cottage for the evening, she couldn't help but feel that the mystery of the locked garden gate had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The following morning dawned with a grey drizzle that matched the sombre mood in St. Mary Mead. News of Lady Montgomery's murder had spread through the village like wildfire, and by breakfast time the tea shops and bakeries buzzed with theories and speculation. Miss Marple sat in her garden, sheltered from the light rain by her porch overhang, knitting a delicate pattern while entertaining an unexpected visitor. Inspector Craddock had arrived shortly, after 8, hoping to gain further insights from their conversation. Stevens claims he must have dropped his keys somewhere in the garden while working, the inspector explained, accepting a cup of tea. "We searched the grounds thoroughly, but found nothing." "How curious," Miss Marple commented, her needles clicking softly. "And what of the scratches on the lock?" "The forensic team confirms they're recent. Someone definitely attempted to pick it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Mr. Carmichael? I couldn't help noticing your conversation with him yesterday. Seemed rather intense. The young man has a temper," Craddock admitted. "And motive certainly. Lady Montgomery's solicitor confirmed she was indeed planning to change her will, significantly reducing his inheritance in favour of the Horticultural Society. Was Mr. Carmichael aware of this change? He denies it, but Miss Jenkins believes Lady Montgomery may have informed him during their argument yesterday morning. Miss Marple set her knitting aside momentarily. "Inspector, did you happen to inquire about the roses that were cut?" "Indeed. According to Stevens, cuttings from the new variety, properly grafted, could be worth thousands to a competitor. Lady Montgomery was to present it at the Royal Horticultural Show next month." "And where was Stevens during the garden party?" "He claims he was working in the greenhouse, though no one can confirm this." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dolly Bantry, who hurried up the garden path without her usual cheerfulness. "Jane, you'll never believe what I've just heard at the bakery," she exclaimed, barely acknowledging Inspector Craddock. "They're saying Flora Jenkins and Peter Carmichael were seen arguing fiercely the night before the murder." "Arguing about what, Mrs. Bantry?" Craddock asked, suddenly alert. "Apparently, they knew each other before he arrived at Primrose Hall. Martha Keene's niece works at a florist in London, where Flora used to be employed. She says Peter would visit Flora there regularly until about a year ago, when something happened between them." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes registered interest. "A prior relationship that neither mentioned to us. Most illuminating." "Inspector," Craddock rose, "I believe I should speak with Miss Jenkins again. Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple." After he departed, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "There's more, Jane. Reverend Hawthorne told me he saw Lady Montgomery in the churchyard 2 days ago, standing by a very old grave, one of the Carmichaels from the 1930s. She seemed distressed." "Which Carmichael grave precisely?" "Thomas Carmichael, Peter's grandfather, Lady Montgomery's brother." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "And there's talk about the solicitor's visit too. Miss Blacklock's maid overheard Lady Montgomery telling Miss Simmons that justice would finally be done, after all these years." Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. Old secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in families. "Speaking of secrets," Mrs. Bantry continued, "Dr. Carraway seemed particularly affected by the murder, didn't he? I saw him afterward, white as a sheet. Miss Blacklock mentioned he nearly fainted when examining the body." "Professional distress, perhaps." "Perhaps, though Emily at the post office swears she's seen him at Primrose Hall several times in recent weeks, always in the evening after his surgery hours." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. "Has anyone spoken with Miss Jenkins this morning?" "She's still at Primrose Hall. The police asked her to remain available. Poor thing looks absolutely shattered. And there's something odd about Stevens, too." Before Mrs. Bantry could elaborate, they were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Letitia Blacklock, who came hurrying up the garden path with uncharacteristic urgency. "Miss Marple, I've just had the most disturbing conversation with young Peter Carmichael. He came to my cottage looking for information about his grandfather. Seemed absolutely desperate to know if there were any letters or documents from that time." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And what did you tell him?" "That I knew nothing of such matters. I was barely 20 when Thomas Carmichael died. There was some scandal, as I recall, though it was all very hushed up." "What kind of scandal?" Mrs. Bantry asked eagerly. "I'm not entirely certain. Miss Blacklock replied, "but it involved Lady Montgomery too. The siblings quarrelled bitterly just before Thomas's death. He died rather suddenly, you know. Heart failure, they said." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was rapidly connecting threads. Miss Blacklock, was there any mention of roses in relation to this family dispute? The question seemed to surprise both visitors, but Miss Blacklock nodded slowly. "Now that you mention it, yes. Thomas Carmichael was something of a horticulturist himself. I believe there was some disagreement about a particular variety they developed together." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village post office, ostensibly to mail a letter. The real purpose of her visit was to speak with Emily Garfield, whose position as postmistress gave her unparalleled insight into village affairs. "Dr. Carraway's visits to Primrose Hall," Emily whispered when questioned. "Oh, yes, at least twice weekly for the past month. Always arrived after 6 and stayed about an hour. Lady Montgomery was having heart troubles, they say, though she kept it quiet. Did he visit the day before the murder?" "Indeed he did. Looked rather agitated when he left too. Nearly ran into my George as he was driving away." On her walk home, Miss Marple paused by the church, drawn to the old graveyard. She located Thomas Carmichael's headstone easily enough, an imposing marble affair with an inscription that had weathered poorly over the decades. But what caught her attention was the fresh rose placed upon it, a distinctive bloom with unusual peach-coloured petals streaked with crimson. A rose identical to the new variety Lady Montgomery had been developing. As Miss Marple contemplated this discovery, she noticed Stevens watching her from behind the church wall. Their eyes met briefly before the old gardener turned and hurried away, his worn cap pulled low over his face. That evening, as darkness fell over the village, the telephone rang in Miss Marple's cottage. It was Miss Jenkins, her voice trembling with urgency. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you. There's something you need to know, something about the roses and the Carmichael family history. I found a locked box in Lady Montgomery's desk with old letters. I think they explain everything." "My dear, you should tell Inspector Craddock immediately." "I tried, but he's gone to London to check Peter's alibi. Miss Marple, I'm frightened. I think someone knows I found these letters. The garden gate just creaked open, but Stevens left hours ago." The line went dead with alarming suddenness. Chapter 4. Shadows in the garden. Miss Marple wasted no time. Despite the late hour, she telephoned Dr. Carraway, requesting he drive her immediately to Primrose Hall. The urgency in her voice must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, for he arrived within minutes. "Miss Jenkins may be in danger," she explained as they hurried to his car. "She discovered something, letters that might explain the murder." As they drove through the darkened village, Miss Marple briefly recounted her conversation with Miss Jenkins. "I treated Lady Montgomery for a heart condition," Dr. Carraway admitted, confirming Emily's gossip. "She swore me to secrecy, didn't want anyone treating her differently. But I don't see how that connects to her murder." "Perhaps it doesn't," Miss Marple said, "but secrets have a way of intertwining." They found Primrose Hall eerily silent, its windows dark, except for a single light in Lady Montgomery's study. The front door stood slightly ajar. "Wait here," Dr. Carraway instructed, but Miss Marple had no intention of staying behind. "I believe 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, Doctor," she said firmly. Following him into the house, they moved quietly through the dim entrance hall, guided by the faint light spilling from the study. The door was open, papers scattered across the floor, as if someone had searched the room in haste. A desk drawer hung open, its lock broken, but there was no sign of Miss Jenkins. "The garden," Miss Marple said suddenly. "She mentioned the garden gate." Retrieving a flashlight from Lady Montgomery's desk, they made their way through the house and out the back door. The night was cloudy, with only occasional glimpses of moonlight illuminating their path to the secret garden. The wrought iron gate stood open, creaking slightly in the gentle breeze. Dr. Carroway's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the garden's eerie nighttime transformation. The prize roses, so vibrant by day, appeared black and twisted in the harsh light. "Miss Jenkins," Dr. Carroway called softly. "Flora!" A muffled sound came from the garden shed, not quite a cry, but enough to draw their attention. Dr. Carroway rushed forward, Miss Marple following more cautiously behind. They found Miss Jenkins bound to a chair, a gag fastened across her mouth. Her eyes widened with relief as Dr. Carroway removed the cloth. "Thank God," she gasped. "I thought no one would come." While the doctor untied her, Miss Marple surveyed the shed with careful attention. "Who did this to you, my dear?" "I don't know. I was in Lady Montgomery's study when I heard something in the garden. I went to investigate and someone grabbed me from behind. I didn't see a face." Miss Jenkins rubbed her wrists where the ropes had cut into her skin. "They kept asking about the letters, where I'd hidden them. And where did you hide them?" Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Jenkins hesitated, glancing at Dr. Carroway. I put them in my room, under the floorboard beneath my bed." Once Miss Jenkins was safely installed in the kitchen with a strong cup of tea, Dr. Carroway suggested calling the police. Miss Marple, however, had other ideas. "Not yet, Doctor. First, I think we should see these letters Miss Jenkins discovered." Miss Jenkins led them upstairs to her modest bedroom, where she pried up a loose floorboard and retrieved a small metal box. Inside were several yellowed letters, carefully preserved despite their age. Their correspondence between Lady Montgomery and her brother Thomas Carmichael, Miss Jenkins explained, dating from 1935 to 1937, the year he died. They reveal something quite shocking. Miss Marple examined the letters with great care. As she read, her expression remained impassive, but her eyes reflected understanding. So, Thomas Carmichael discovered a naturally occurring rose mutation, what would now be called a sport, in their shared garden, Miss Marple summarized, a unique variety that could have made their fortune. "Yes," Miss Jenkins confirmed, but Lady Montgomery claimed it as her own discovery. By the time Thomas realized what she'd done, she had already begun the process of registering it under her name. "The Montgomery Glory," Dr. Carroway read from one of the letters. "It became her first famous rose, and the foundation of her reputation as a rose breeder," Miss Jenkins added. "Thomas threatened to expose her, but then he died suddenly, of heart failure. These letters suggest Lady Montgomery may have had something to do with his death." Miss Marple carefully replaced the letters in their box. "And the new rose variety, the one named for the Queen?" "Also disputed," Miss Jenkins said. "In the most recent letter, dated just 2 months ago, Peter Carmichael claims it was based on his father's work, notes that Thomas left behind. He demanded Lady Montgomery acknowledge his family's contribution. Or what? Dr. Carraway asked. Or he would expose the truth about the Montgomery glory and suggest that her entire career was built on a theft and possibly a murder. The three sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. "Miss Jenkins, when did you first learn of this family history?" "Only yesterday, when I found the box. Lady Montgomery had always kept it locked in her desk. And how did you know to look there?" Miss Jenkins looked startled by the question. I didn't exactly. I was searching for her will. Inspector Craddock asked me to locate it." Dr. Carraway frowned. "But surely the solicitor, Miss Simmons, would have the will." "A copy, yes, but Lady Montgomery kept the original in her desk." Miss Jenkins twisted her hands nervously. "At least that's what I thought." Miss Marple's gentle eyes studied the young woman carefully. "You mentioned you knew Peter Carmichael before his arrival at Primrose Hall." Miss Jenkins flushed. "Yes, we were close for a time in London. He worked at Chelsea Physic Garden. He's a botanist by training. That's how we met, through my position at the florist." "And did he confide in you about his suspicions regarding Lady Montgomery?" "Not at first, but eventually, yes. He'd found some of his grandfather's papers and became convinced that Lady Montgomery had stolen his work and possibly," she couldn't finish the sentence, "possibly murdered her own brother," Miss Marple completed quietly. "A terrible accusation. I didn't believe it," Miss Jenkins insisted. "Or at least I didn't want to. But then Peter found more evidence, and when he confronted Lady Montgomery, she didn't exactly deny it." Dr. Carraway looked horrified. "Are you suggesting Lady Montgomery confessed to a murder committed nearly 50 years ago?" "Not in so many words. But according to Peter, she said some things would die with her." That's when he decided to come to Primrose Hall, to search for proof. As they descended the stairs, a sudden noise from the direction of the study caught their attention. Miss Marple placed a warning hand on Dr. Carraway's arm. "Someone is still in the house," she whispered. Before they could retreat, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. Stevens, the gardener, clutching a leather-bound notebook. "I heard voices," he said, his rheumy eyes darting between them. "I thought the burglar had returned." "What burglar?" Dr. Carraway demanded. Stevens hesitated. "Someone broke into the greenhouse last night, took cuttings from the Queen Elizabeth rose." "And what brings you to the house at this hour, Mr. Stevens?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. The old gardener held up the notebook. "Lady Montgomery's rose-breeding records. I thought they should be kept safe." As he spoke, headlights swept across the front windows, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. Inspector Craddock had returned from London, and the case was about to take yet another turn. Chapter 5. A tangle of thorns, Inspector Craddock was not alone. Behind him followed Peter Carmichael, his handsome face taut with tension. "Miss Jenkins," Craddock said, taking in the scene with practised efficiency. "I received a report you might be in danger. Are you all right?" "Someone attacked her in the garden," Dr. Carraway explained before Miss Jenkins could answer. "Tied her up in the shed. If Miss Marple hadn't called me—" "Miss Marple," the inspector acknowledged with a nod. "I might have known you'd be involved. And Stevens, what brings you here at this hour?" The old gardener clutched Lady Montgomery's notebook protectively. "Keeping watch, sir. After what happened to her ladyship, I've been checking the grounds each night." Inside the house, Craddock's tone was sceptical. "I heard noises," Stevens replied defensively. "Thought someone might be stealing her ladyship's papers." Peter Carmichael stepped forward. "What papers exactly? More family secrets." The tension in the entrance hall was palpable. Miss Marple observed the subtle interplay between the parties. Peter's barely contained anger, Stevens's nervous defensiveness, Miss Jenkins's apprehension. "Perhaps we should all sit down," she suggested calmly. "Inspector, I believe Miss Jenkins has discovered something significant about the Montgomery and Carmichael families." They moved to the drawing-room, where Miss Jenkins explained about the letters while Peter Carmichael paced restlessly by the window. "So you believe Lady Montgomery stole her brother's work and built her career on it," Craddock summarized. "Potentially even had a hand in his death." "The evidence suggests it," Miss Jenkins replied, glancing anxiously toward Peter. "That's putting it mildly," Peter interjected bitterly. "She was a fraud. My grandfather created the Montgomery glory, not her, and when he threatened to expose her, she poisoned him." "That's quite an accusation, Mr. Carmichael," Craddock said. "Do you have proof?" "The letters aren't enough?" Peter demanded. "She as good as admitted it to me the day before she died. And then you killed her," Stevens said suddenly, his voice shaking with emotion. "I saw you arguing with her ladyship in the secret garden that morning, before the party." All eyes turned to Peter, who had gone very still. "Is this true, Mr. Carmichael?" Craddock asked. "You told me you hadn't spoken to your great-aunt since the previous evening." Peter's jaw tightened. "Stevens is mistaken. I wasn't in the garden that morning." "I know what I saw," Stevens insisted. "You were waving your arms about, shouting. Then you stormed off toward the woods. My investigation in London confirms you've been in financial difficulties, Mr. Carmichael," Craddock continued. "Significant gambling debts, a motive for wanting your inheritance sooner rather than later." "I didn't kill her," Peter said through gritted teeth. "Why would I? Yes, I came here to confront her about my grandfather, but I was planning to expose her publicly. Killing her would accomplish nothing." "Except preventing her from changing her will," Miss Jenkins said quietly. "She told you she was leaving everything to the Horticultural Society, didn't she?" Peter looked at her with an expression of betrayal. "So you've turned against me too, Flora? After everything?" Miss Marple, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "Inspector, may I ask what Mr. Stevens was doing in the secret garden that morning? I understood his duties were confined to the greenhouse on party days." Stevens blinked at the unexpected question. "Checking the roses, of course. Had to make sure they were perfect for her ladyship's tour." "And did you notice anything unusual? Besides Mr. Carmichael's presence, that is." "Not as such." Stevens frowned. "Though the garden gate was unlocked when I arrived, which was odd. Her ladyship always kept it locked." "And what time was this?" "Around 10 in the morning, I'd say. Yet Lady Montgomery was killed shortly before 4 in the afternoon," Craddock pointed out. "The garden would have been locked again by then, unless someone had taken a copy of the key." Miss Marple suggested. Or perhaps the gate was never properly relocked after Mr. Stevens's morning visit. Stevens shook his head emphatically. No, no. I'm certain her ladyship locked it afterward. She was very particular about that gate. Mr. Stevens, Miss Marple said gently, you mentioned seeing Peter Carmichael arguing with Lady Montgomery in the garden that morning. Yet you just said the gate was unlocked when you arrived. Who let Mr. Carmichael into the garden? The old gardener's face flushed. Well, perhaps he was already inside when I got there. But how would he have entered without a key? Miss Marple persisted. I don't know. Stephen's composure cracked slightly. Maybe her ladyship let him in. Or maybe you're lying, Peter said harshly. I wasn't in that garden that morning. I was in the village at the post office. Miss Garfield can confirm it. Inspector Craddock made a note. We'll check that alibi, Mr. Carmichael. Now, about these letters, Miss Jenkins. May I see them? As Miss Jenkins went to retrieve the box from upstairs, Miss Marple turned her attention to Stevens, who was still clutching Lady Montgomery's notebook. Those are her rose-breeding records, Mr. Stevens? Yes, he replied guardedly. 50 years of work, including her work on the Montgomery Glory. The old man's fingers tightened on the leather binding. That was before my time. I came to Primrose Hall in 1940, after Mr. Thomas died. Yet you seem very protective of Lady Montgomery's reputation, Miss Marple observed. She was a great woman, Stevens said stubbornly. A true artist with roses. Miss Jenkins returned with the box of letters, which she handed to Inspector Craddock. As he began to examine them, Dr. Carroway cleared his throat. Inspector, there's something else you should know. When I examined Lady Montgomery's body, I noticed traces of digitalis poisoning. Craddock looked up sharply. Poison? You didn't mention this in your initial report. The symptoms were subtle, and without a specific reason to look for it, I might have missed it entirely. But given what we've learned about Thomas Carmichael's death... You think the same person poisoned both siblings? Craddock asked. That's impossible, Peter interjected. My grandfather died nearly 50 years ago. Unless, Miss Marple suggested quietly, someone was settling an old score. A heavy silence fell over the room. It was Miss Jenkins who finally broke it. There's something else in that box, she said hesitantly. A small diary kept by Thomas Carmichael during his final months. He suspected someone was poisoning him slowly. Lady Montgomery, Peter said firmly. He doesn't name names, Miss Jenkins replied. But he mentions a trusted confidant who might be responsible. Inspector Craddock withdrew a small leather-bound volume from beneath the letters. This diary may be crucial evidence. I'll need to take it for analysis. As they discussed the implications of these revelations, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the window overlooking the garden. In the faint glow of dawn, now breaking over Primrose Hall, she noticed something peculiar. A shadow moving near the greenhouse. Inspector, she said softly, I believe someone is in the greenhouse. Craddock moved swiftly to the window. You're right. Constable Phillips is still outside. I'll have him investigate. But before he could issue the order, the greenhouse door opened, and a figure emerged carrying what appeared to be a small case. It's Miss Simmons, Miss Jenkins said with surprise. Lady Montgomery's solicitor. What is she doing here at this hour? As they watched, the solicitor hurried across the lawn toward a side gate, unaware she was being observed. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Very interesting indeed." Inspector Craddock dispatched his constable to intercept Miss Simmons, while the rest of them continued to ponder the increasingly complex web of motives and opportunities surrounding Lady Montgomery's death. What none of them realized was that the final piece of the puzzle lay not in the greenhouse or the secret garden, but in the village churchyard, where Thomas Carmichael's grave held one more secret. A secret that Miss Marple alone was beginning to understand. Chapter 6. Secrets Unearthed. The morning light had strengthened by the time Constable Phillips returned, with a reluctant Henrietta Simmons in tow. The solicitor, an elegant woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair, carried herself with professional composure despite the early hour and unexpected interception. "Inspector Craddock," she acknowledged coolly. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to visit my late client's property." "At 5 in the morning, Miss Simmons," Craddock countered. "Specifically in the greenhouse?" Miss Simmons placed her leather case on a side table. "Lady Montgomery entrusted me with certain responsibilities following her death, one of which was securing particular plant specimens. Rose cuttings," Miss Marple suggested quietly from her position by the fireplace. The solicitor cast a sharp glance in her direction. "Yes, as a matter of fact. Cuttings of the Queen Elizabeth variety, which were to be delivered to the Royal Horticultural Society according to Lady Montgomery's explicit instructions." "Why not simply inform the police of these instructions?" Dr. Carroway asked. "Professional confidentiality," Miss Simmons replied smoothly. "And I had no reason to believe the police would be interested in horticultural matters." Inspector Craddock's expression remained sceptical. "You were at the garden party when Lady Montgomery was murdered, yet you made no mention of these special instructions during your initial interview." "You asked about her will and financial matters, Inspector, not about her roses." "Speaking of her will," Peter Carmichael interrupted, "is it true my great-aunt planned to disinherit me in favour of the Horticultural Society?" Miss Simmons hesitated, her professional reserve momentarily faltering. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details until the official reading, but Lady Montgomery had been considering certain changes." "Changes she discussed with you during your meeting just before the garden party," Miss Marple commented. "You seem remarkably well informed, Miss—" "Marple. Jane Marple." Recognition flickered in the solicitor's eyes. "Ah, the village detective Lady Montgomery mentioned. She said you had an uncanny ability to see through deception." "Lady Montgomery spoke of me." Miss Marple seemed genuinely surprised. "She spoke of many things during our final meeting," Miss Simmons said carefully. "She was putting her affairs in order." "As if she expected something to happen to her," Inspector Craddock suggested. Miss Simmons didn't deny it. She was concerned about threats she had received. This revelation caused a stir among those assembled in the drawing-room. "What kind of threats?" Craddock demanded. "Anonymous letters suggesting that her horticultural reputation was built on fraud, and that evidence would soon come to light." Miss Simmons glanced toward Peter. "She believed they came from someone within her family." "I never sent any letters," Peter said heatedly. "I confronted her directly about my grandfather's work. These letters began arriving months before your visit, Mr. Carmichael," the solicitor replied. "Lady Montgomery had been receiving them since last autumn." Miss Marple, who had been observing the exchange with keen interest, suddenly addressed Stevens. "Mr. Stevens, how long have you worked at Primrose Hall?" The old gardener seemed startled by the question. "Nearly 45 years, as I mentioned, since 1940. "So you would have known Thomas Carmichael's work, if only by reputation?" "Well, her ladyship sometimes mentioned her brother's early experiments," Stevens admitted reluctantly. "Did she ever express any guilt about the Montgomery glory?" Stevens' weathered face tightened. "That's not something we discussed." "Yet you were more than just an employee to Lady Montgomery, weren't you?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "After so many years, you were practically family." "I was devoted to her ladyship," Stevens said stiffly, "and to her work." Inspector Craddock, sensing a shift in the conversation, intervened. "Miss Simmons, these rose cuttings you were collecting, why the urgency and secrecy?" The solicitor squared her shoulders. "The Queen Elizabeth variety must be registered within 7 days of Lady Montgomery's death to secure patent rights. Those were her explicit instructions. Any delay could result in complications, especially given the disputed nature of her work." "Disputed?" Peter seized on the word. "So you knew the roses were stolen from my family?" "I knew no such thing," Miss Simmons replied sharply. "I was referring to potential challenges from other breeders. The rose industry is more cutthroat than you might imagine, Mr. Carmichael." While this exchange continued, Miss Marple had been studying Lady Montgomery's rose-breeding notebook, which Stevens had reluctantly surrendered to the inspector. She turned the pages slowly, her expression thoughtful. "These entries go back decades," she remarked. "All in the same handwriting, Lady Montgomery's, I presume." "Yes," Stevens confirmed. "She documented everything meticulously, including her work with Thomas Carmichael in the 1930s. Stevens hesitated before answering. "Those early records are less detailed." Miss Marple turned to a particular page. Yet here, in an entry from 1935, she references T.C.'s discovery of the apricot sport in the South Garden. That would be Thomas Carmichael's discovery, would it not? The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. It was Peter who finally spoke. "So she did acknowledge his work, at least privately." "It seems so," Miss Marple agreed, "which makes the mystery of these threatening letters all the more perplexing. If Lady Montgomery privately acknowledged her brother's contribution, why would she feel so threatened by its exposure?" "Unless," Dr. Carroway suggested slowly, "the threat wasn't about the roses at all, but about something else. Entirely, something connected to Thomas Carmichael's death." Miss Jenkins, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "The diary mentions poison, small doses over time. Could Lady Montgomery really have killed her own brother? People have killed for less than horticultural fame," Craddock observed, grimly. "But then who killed Lady Montgomery?" Dr. Carroway asked. "If this is about settling old scores, who would want to avenge Thomas Carmichael after all these years?" All eyes turned to Peter, the obvious suspect. He met their gaze unflinchingly. "I wanted justice for my grandfather, not revenge, and certainly not murder." "Yet you stood to inherit everything," Miss Simmons pointed out, "until Lady Montgomery decided to change her will. A change that might have been prompted by these threatening letters," Miss Marple mused. "Inspector, I believe there's one place we haven't fully investigated yet. Thomas Carmichael's grave." Craddock looked perplexed. The grave? What could that possibly tell us after 50 years? Not the grave itself, Miss Marple clarified. But I noticed something interesting yesterday. A very distinctive rose placed upon it. A rose identical to Lady Montgomery's new Queen Elizabeth variety. Only a handful of people had access to that rose, Stevens said, his voice unexpectedly sharp. It was kept under lock and key in the secret garden. Precisely, Miss Marple replied, which is why I find it so intriguing that it appeared on Thomas Carmichael's grave the day after Lady Montgomery's murder. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, they were interrupted by the arrival of a constable bearing an urgent message for Inspector Craddock. The inspector read it quickly, his expression darkening. "It seems our case has taken another turn," he announced grimly. "The gardener's cottage has been ransacked, and among the debris they found this." He held up an evidence bag containing a key. "Stevens' missing garden key?" Miss Jenkins asked. "No," Craddock replied. "According to the constable, this appears to be a duplicate, recently made, judging by the lack of wear. And beside it was this." He produced a second bag containing what looked like a small vial. Digitalis, Dr. Carraway identified immediately. The same poison I suspected in Lady Montgomery's system. All eyes turned to Stevens, whose weathered face had gone deathly pale. I don't know anything about this," he stammered. "Someone must have planted those things in my cottage." But Miss Marple was studying not Stevens, but Miss Simmons, whose composed exterior had finally cracked to reveal a flicker of genuine fear. Chapter 7. A Rose. By any other name. "I had nothing to do with those items," Stevens insisted, his voice trembling with either fear or indignation. "Someone is trying to frame me." Inspector Craddock regarded the elderly gardener with professional skepticism. "You had means and opportunity, Mr. Stevens, and as Lady Montgomery's longest-serving employee, you certainly had access to her garden and her person." "But what possible motive could I have?" Stevens demanded. "I was devoted to her ladyship." "Perhaps too devoted," Dr. Carraway suggested quietly. 45 years is a long time to harbour feelings for someone." Stevens' weathered face flushed crimson. That's preposterous. Lady Montgomery was my employer, nothing more." Miss Marple, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Inspector, before we jump to conclusions about Mr. Stevens, I think we should visit Thomas Carmichael's grave. The rose placed there may tell us more than we realise." "A graveyard visit seems rather superfluous given the evidence at hand," Craddock replied. "On the contrary," Miss Marple insisted with gentle firmness. "In my experience, the smallest details often prove most illuminating." Something in her manner convinced the inspector. "Very well. Dr. Carraway, would you mind staying here with Miss Jenkins? Constable Phillips can keep an eye on Mr. Stevens and Miss Simmons." Miss Simmons, who had regained her composure, smiled thinly. "Am I to understand I'm being detained, Inspector?" "Let's call it assisting with inquiries," Craddock replied diplomatically. "None of you should leave until I return." Peter Carmichael rose to his feet. "I'm coming with you. If this concerns my grandfather, I have a right to be there." The small procession made its way to St. Mary Mead's churchyard in the strengthening morning light. Miss Marple led them unerringly to Thomas Carmichael's grave. an imposing monument that spoke of the family's wealth and standing. The distinctive peach and crimson rose still lay upon the marble slab, its unusual coloration immediately apparent, even to untrained eyes. The Queen Elizabeth variety, Peter confirmed, kneeling to examine it without touching. But who would place it here? Someone who knew both roses very well, Miss Marple said. Someone who understood their significance to both families. She bent with surprising agility to study the headstone, running her fingers gently over the weathered inscription. "Beloved brother, gifted horticulturist, taken too soon," she read aloud. "A rather pointed epitaph, wouldn't you say? My father chose those words," Peter said. "He always believed his father's death was suspicious, and yet neither he nor your grandmother ever pursued the matter legally." Craddock noted. They had no proof, just suspicions. Miss Marple continued her examination of the gravesite, her attention caught by something tucked into a crevice where the headstone met its base. With careful fingers, she extracted a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "What is it?" Craddock asked, leaning closer. Miss Marple unfolded the paper gently. A pressed flower, a rose petal to be precise, and a note. She squinted at the faded handwriting. "Forgive me, Thomas, the truth will be known. It's signed simply A." "Amelia," Peter supplied immediately. "Lady Montgomery's given name." "This note appears quite old," Miss Marple observed. "The paper has yellowed significantly, and the ink has faded to brown rather than black. So Lady Montgomery came here years ago to ask forgiveness from her brother?" Inspector Craddock seemed puzzled. "That suggests remorse, not the actions of a calculating murderer." "Unless," Miss Marple suggested, "she was apologizing for something else entirely. Perhaps for taking credit for his work, but not necessarily for his death." Peter scoffed. "A convenient interpretation." "Mr. Carmichael," Miss Marple said gently, "in your research into your grandfather's work, did you ever encounter references to someone with the initials H.S.? Peter frowned. "Not that I recall." "Why?" "Because, you see, when I examined Lady Montgomery's rose-breeding notebook, I noticed something rather curious. The entries about Thomas Carmichael's discoveries in 1935 were followed by several references to H.S. valuable assistance. The handwriting was identical to Lady Montgomery's, but the initials appeared repeatedly in those early years. Craddock's interest was piqued. H.S. could be Henrietta Simmons. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed, "and Miss Simmons appeared notably disturbed when I mentioned Thomas Carmichael's grave." As they continued their examination of the grave, Miss Marple made another discovery. A small metal container partially buried at the edge of the plot, recently disturbed judging by the freshly turned soil around it. Craddock carefully extracted and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young Thomas Carmichael standing between two women, one recognizably a youthful Lady Montgomery, the other unknown to them. "My grandfather," Peter confirmed, studying the photo, "but I don't recognize the second. Woman, I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that we are looking at a much younger Henrietta Simmons." Inspector Craddock examined the photograph more closely. "It could be, but that would make her connection to this family much older than she's," admitted, "and perhaps more personal," Miss Marple added, "which might explain her reaction when we discussed Thomas Carmichael's diary." Peter Carmichael's expression had darkened. If she knew my grandfather, why wouldn't she have mentioned it? Unless she had something to hide. As they made their way back to Primrose Hall, Miss Marple walked slightly apart from the others, her mind working steadily through the accumulating evidence: the duplicated garden key, the digitalis in Stephen's cottage, Lady Montgomery's note of apology, the photograph linking a young Miss Simmons to Thomas Carmichael, all pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape in her mind. Upon their return, they found a tense tableau. Dr. Carroway was examining something Miss Jenkins had discovered while they were gone: a hidden compartment in Lady Montgomery's desk containing a small leather diary, distinct from Thomas Carmichael's. "It's Lady Montgomery's private journal," Miss Jenkins explained. "There are entries dating back to 1935, including the weeks leading up to Thomas Carmichael's death." Inspector Craddock took the diary carefully. This could be crucial evidence. "There's something else," Dr. Carroway added. "Miss Jenkins remembers seeing Lady Montgomery taking medication the day before her death. Pills that don't match her prescribed heart medication. She said they were for anxiety," Miss Jenkins confirmed. "Given to her by a trusted friend." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the doorway, where Constable Phillips stood with a troubled expression. "What is it, Constable?" Craddock asked. "Sir, Miss Simmons is gone," Phillips reported uncomfortably. "She insisted on using the facilities, and when she didn't return after several minutes, I checked and found the bathroom window open. She must have climbed out." Craddock's expression hardened. "Put out an alert immediately. And where's Stevens?" "Still in the kitchen, sir, under guard." The inspector turned to Miss Marple. "You suspected Miss Simmons from the beginning, didn't you?" "I had questions about her involvement," Miss Marple replied carefully. "The timing of her visit the day of the murder, her early morning trip to the greenhouse, her reaction to Thomas, Carmichael's diary. But most of all, I wondered about those initials in Lady Montgomery's notebook, H.S., and what role Henrietta Simmons might have played in the events of 1935. Peter Carmichael seized Lady Montgomery's journal, flipping through the pages with growing agitation until he found what he was looking for. "Listen to this," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "July 15th, 1935 T has threatened to expose the truth about the Montgomery glory. He doesn't understand what such a revelation would do to all our futures. H is beside herself with worry. She begs me to reason with him, but he refuses to listen. I fear what may happen if he proceeds." "H again," Craddock noted. "Presumably Henrietta Simmons." "There's more," Peter continued, turning pages. "August 2nd, 1935. T is showing signs of the illness. H assures me the doses are small enough to avoid detection, yet sufficient for our purpose. I find myself unable to intervene, paralyzed by ambition and fear. God forgive us both." A stunned silence fell over the room as the implications of this entry became clear. "So it wasn't Lady Montgomery who poisoned Thomas Carmichael," Dr. Carroway said slowly. "It was Henrietta Simmons, with Lady Montgomery's knowledge, but not her direct involvement. But why would Miss Simmons want to kill Thomas Carmichael?" Inspector Craddock wondered aloud. Miss Marple, who had been quietly processing all these revelations, finally spoke. "I believe the photograph we found may provide a clue. The way Miss Simmons stood beside Thomas Carmichael suggests a certain intimacy, and if she was involved in the early rose breeding experiments, then she had as much to lose as Lady Montgomery if Thomas exposed the truth. Peter finished, his expression grim. But that still doesn't explain who killed Lady Montgomery. Miss Marple's gentle blue eyes held a sharp intelligence. Perhaps the answer lies not in who wanted to silence Lady Montgomery, but in who wanted to avenge Thomas Carmichael, someone who finally discovered the truth about his death. As they contemplated this possibility, they were startled by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see Constable Phillips wrestling with a figure at the garden gate. Henrietta, Simmons, clutching a small suitcase, desperately trying to escape. Chapter 8. Confessions Among the Roses. The library at Primrose Hall had become a makeshift interrogation room. Henrietta Simmons sat rigidly in an armchair, her elegant composure now visibly strained. Inspector Craddock stood before her while the others watched from various positions around the room, all except Miss Marple, who had taken a seat directly opposite the solicitor, her knitting needles moving steadily as she observed. "Running hardly suggests innocence, Miss Simmons," Craddock said sternly. "I panicked," she admitted, adjusting her pearl necklace with trembling fingers, "when I realized where your investigation was heading. To Thomas Carmichael's murder in 1935, Craddock finished for her. "A case long closed," Miss Simmons countered. "His death was ruled natural causes, heart failure." "Yet Lady Montgomery's journal suggests otherwise," Peter said accusingly. "It suggests you poisoned my grandfather while she stood by and let it happen." Miss Simmons closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they held a weariness that seemed to reach back decades. "Wasn't that simple?" she said quietly. "Nothing ever is." "Then explain it to us," Inspector Craddock prompted. Miss Simmons glanced at Miss Marple, whose placid expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. "I was 22 when I first came to Primrose Hall," Miss Simmons began. "Fresh from university, with a degree in botany, unusual for a woman in those days. The Montgomerys were pioneering rose breeders, and I secured a position as a research assistant. Thomas was brilliant, charming, and married. You were in love with him," Miss Marple stated simply, not looking up from her knitting. "Desperately," Miss Simmons acknowledged, "and I believed he loved me. We worked closely together, too closely. The rose that would later become the Montgomery glory was indeed his discovery, but I was there when he found the sport in the South Garden. I helped him isolate and develop it." "And then what happened?" Craddock asked. "Amelia, Lady Montgomery, discovered our affair. Thomas's wife was her closest friend, you see. She was furious, threatened to expose us both, ruin our reputations. But then she offered an alternative. The rose," Peter said bitterly. Miss Simmons nodded. "If Thomas would allow her to claim credit for the discovery, she would keep our secret. He refused initially, but then what?" Craddock pressed. "His wife became pregnant. Thomas couldn't bear the scandal, not with a child coming. So he agreed to Amelia's terms, temporarily. The Montgomery glory was credited to her, launched her career. He told himself it was just one rose, that there would be others. But he changed his mind," Miss Marple suggested, her needles pausing momentarily. 2 years later, after his son was born, he felt secure enough in his marriage to withstand any scandal. He told Amelia he intended to reclaim his work, expose the truth. Miss Simmons's voice had grown tight with suppressed emotion. It would have ruined her reputation utterly. Everything she'd built would collapse. So you poisoned him, Peter said flatly. Miss Simmons didn't immediately deny it. Thomas had a heart condition, mild but real. The digitalis was meant to aggravate it, make his death appear natural. I never intended. It was supposed to be gradual, gentle even. There's nothing gentle about murder, Miss Simmons, Inspector Craddock said coldly. You don't understand. I didn't want him to die. For the first time, her professional demeanour completely cracked. I only wanted to make him ill enough to postpone his announcement. But Amelia, she increased the dosage without telling me. By the time I realized what she'd done, it was too late. A heavy silence filled the room. Even Peter seemed momentarily stunned by this confession. And you've lived with this knowledge all these years, Miss Marple said softly, eventually becoming Lady Montgomery's solicitor, keeping close to her, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps to ensure the secret remained buried. We were bound by our crime, Miss Simmons admitted. Neither could expose the other without destroying herself. Inspector Craddock leaned forward, his expression stern but professional. This brings us to Lady Montgomery's murder. Did you kill her, Miss Simmons? After all these years, did you finally decide to silence her permanently? No. The denial came swiftly. I had no reason to kill Amelia. Our arrangement worked for both of us, until the threatening letters began, Miss Marple pointed out. Letters suggesting that the truth about Thomas Carmichael's death might come to light. Miss Simmons went very still. How did you know about that specific threat? I didn't, Miss Marple replied with mild satisfaction. You've just confirmed it. The solicitor closed her eyes briefly. The letters mentioned both the roses and Thomas's death. At first, we thought they came from Peter, but they started long before his visit. Who else knew about Thomas Carmichael's death? Craddock asked. No one, at least no one who could prove anything. Miss Simmons glanced nervously toward the door. Except perhaps Stevens. Stevens? Dr. Carroway echoed with surprise. The gardener? He wasn't always just a gardener, Miss Simmons explained. In the early days, he was Thomas's assistant. He worked alongside us in the experimental gardens. He knew about Thomas's discovery of the Montgomery glory, and he was devoted to him. After Thomas died, he stayed on at Primrose Hall. Amelia felt it safer to keep him close, I think. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. And did Stevens ever give any indication that he suspected foul play in Thomas Carmichael's death? Not explicitly, but there were comments over the years, references to Thomas's untimely passing, questions about his final days. And recently, when the Queen Elizabeth Rose was being developed, he became increasingly agitated, mentioning how it reminded him of the Montgomery glory situation. Peter Carmichael, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke. You're suggesting Stevens killed Lady Montgomery to avenge my grandfather? After nearly 50 years, the duplicated key and digitalis were found in his cottage, Craddock pointed out. Planted there, obviously, Miss Jenkins interjected, to frame him. By whom? Craddock asked. All eyes turned to Miss Simmons, who shook her head vehemently. Not by me. I had no reason to frame Stevens. Unless, Miss Marple suggested quietly, he had finally discovered evidence of your involvement in Thomas Carmichael's death. The solicitor's face paled. That's preposterous. Yet her denial lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand moved instinctively to her suitcase. "May I ask what you're carrying in that case, Miss Simmons?" Miss Marple inquired, innocently. "It seems rather heavy for rose cuttings." Inspector Craddock, taking the hint, reached for the suitcase. Miss Simmons clutched it protectively. "This is private property. You have no right." "I'm investigating a murder, Miss Simmons," Craddock replied firmly. "I have every right." When the suitcase was opened, it revealed not only carefully packaged rose cuttings, but also a stack of old letters tied with faded ribbon, a small leather notebook distinct from the ones they'd already discovered, and a bottle of digitalis almost identical to the one found in Stephen's cottage. "I can explain," Miss Simmons began, but her voice faltered as Inspector Craddock extracted the notebook. Thomas Carmichael's original rose-breeding journal, he identified, leafing through its yellowed pages, with detailed notes on the development of what would become the Montgomery Glory. "And the murder weapon," Dr. Carraway added, pointing to the digitalis. "That proves nothing," Miss Simmons insisted. "Those things were Amelia's. I was taking them for safekeeping." "After breaking into Stephen's cottage to plant duplicates," Craddock suggested sceptically. Miss Simmons's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand. Stevens had discovered the truth. He found Thomas's original journal hidden in the garden shed. Amelia never knew Thomas kept separate records. Stevens confronted her the morning of the garden party. I overheard them arguing in the secret garden. So you killed Lady Montgomery to protect your secret," Peter accused. But Miss Marple, who had been watching the exchanges with her characteristic attentiveness, suddenly shook her head. "I don't believe Miss Simmons killed Lady Montgomery," she said quietly. "The timing doesn't fit. She was with other guests when Lady Montgomery went to check the roses before the tour." All eyes turned to her with varying degrees of surprise. "Then who did kill her?" Inspector Craddock asked. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and folded her hands in her lap. "I believe the answer lies in knowing who else might have overheard that confrontation in the secret garden, and who had reason to act on what they learned." As if on cue, they heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by hurried footsteps. Chapter 9. The Garden's Secret Keeper. Inspector Craddock reacted instantly to the sound of breaking glass. "Phillips, check the back of the house," he commanded, already moving towards the doorway. "It came from the kitchen," Dr. Carraway said. Following quickly behind, they found Constable Phillips sprawled on the floor, a nasty bruise forming on his temple. The kitchen window had been shattered from the inside, its jagged edges suggesting someone had made a hasty exit. "Stevens," Phillips groaned, attempting to sit up. "I was bringing him tea when he struck me with something heavy. Never saw it coming." Through the broken window, they could see the elderly gardener making his way with surprising speed toward the secret garden, clutching something to his chest. "Stay with Miss Simmons," Craddock instructed Miss Jenkins, then turned to the others. "Dr. Carraway, see to the constable. Peter, with me." Miss Marple, who had followed them to the kitchen, spoke quickly. "Be careful, Inspector. If Stevens killed Lady Montgomery, he's already proven himself capable of violence." Craddock and Peter hurried out through the kitchen door in pursuit. Miss Marple, moving with more deliberation but no less purpose, followed at her own pace. Stevens had reached the wrought iron gate by the time his pursuers emerged from the house. He fumbled briefly with a key, not the duplicate found in his cottage, but his own original, which he must have recovered. The gate swung open, and he disappeared, inside the secret garden. Why would he run to a place with only one exit? Peter wondered aloud as they approached. Because there's something in there he needs, Craddock surmised, slowing his pace as they neared the gate. Something worth risking capture for. They entered the garden cautiously. The morning sun now illuminated the carefully tended beds of prize roses, including the corner where Lady Montgomery's body had been discovered just 2 days earlier. Of Stevens, however, there was no immediate sign. "He can't have just vanished," Peter said, scanning the garden. A soft scraping sound drew their attention to a stone bench near the far wall. Stevens knelt beside it, frantically prying at one of the paving stones beneath with a garden trowel. "Stevens!" Craddock called sharply. "Step away from there, now!" The old gardener looked up, his weathered face a mask of desperation. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "I have to get it before it's too late." "Get what?" Peter demanded, approaching cautiously. "Proof," Stevens replied, returning to his digging. "The only real proof." Inspector Craddock moved forward to apprehend him, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, having arrived at the garden gate slightly breathless from her exertion. "Let him finish. Miss Marple, he's a murder suspect attempting to destroy evidence," Craddock objected. "Or perhaps retrieving it," she countered. "Let's see what's so important, shall we?" With a final heave, Stevens loosened the paving stone and set it aside, revealing a small cavity beneath. From this hiding place, he withdrew an object wrapped in oilcloth, which he clutched to his chest as he stood to face them. "Is that what you used to kill Lady Montgomery?" Craddock asked grimly. "I never killed her ladyship," Stevens replied, his voice breaking. "I loved her, despite everything. Despite knowing she was involved in Thomas Carmichael's death." Miss Marple suggested gently. Stevens's rheumy eyes filled with tears. "I suspected, yes. For years I suspected, but I never knew for certain until recently. When you found Thomas Carmichael's hidden journal," Miss Marple supplied. The old gardener looked at her in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "Miss Simmons mentioned it. She overheard your confrontation with Lady Montgomery the morning of the garden party." Stephen's expression hardened at the mention of the solicitor. "She was there too, in 1935, working with Thomas on his roses. After he died, she vanished for years, then reappeared as a solicitor. Lady Montgomery kept her close. Guilt, perhaps, or fear." "What did you say to Lady Montgomery that morning?" Craddock asked. "I told her I knew the truth," Stephen said simply, "that Thomas had been poisoned, and I had proof." He gestured to the package in his hands. His final journal, the one he kept secret from everyone. He suspected someone was poisoning him and recorded his symptoms along with his suspicions. And how did Lady Montgomery react to this accusation? Miss Marple inquired. "She didn't deny it," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "She asked for time to set things right, said she'd been living with the guilt for decades and wanted to make amends before the truth came out. She promised to change her will, acknowledge Thomas's work publicly, and reveal everything about his death." "So why kill her?" Peter demanded, if she was finally going to confess. I told you, I didn't kill her, Stevens insisted. When I left her that morning, she was alive and planning to include a full confession in her speech at the garden party. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That explains why she seemed so agitated before the party, and why she mentioned to Miss Jenkins that some secrets can't stay buried forever. Inspector Craddock still looked sceptical. If you didn't kill her, why run? Why hide this evidence instead of bringing it forward? Because I heard someone else in the garden during our conversation, Stevens explained. Someone hiding among the roses. I thought it was Miss Simmons, but I couldn't be certain. After Lady Montgomery was killed, I realized whoever overheard us must have silenced her before she could confess. And you feared you'd be next, Miss Marple concluded, or framed for her murder, Stevens agreed, which is exactly what happened. The key and poison in my cottage, I never put them there. Peter Carmichael had been studying the old gardener intently. If what you're saying is true, then Lady Montgomery was killed to prevent her confession, not as revenge for my grandfather's death. It seems so, Miss Marple agreed, which narrows our suspect list considerably. A new voice joined the conversation from the garden gate. Indeed it does. They turned to see Dr. Carroway standing there, but his normally compassionate expression had hardened into something cold and calculating. More alarmingly, he held a revolver pointed steadily at the group. "Doctor," Craddock said carefully, "what are you doing?" "Ensuring my survival," Carroway replied calmly. "Please place Thomas Carmichael's journal on the bench, Stevens. Carefully." Miss Marple studied the doctor with her keen blue eyes. "You overheard the conversation between Stevens and Lady Montgomery," she stated. "That's why you were so pale after examining her body. Not from professional distress, but recognition." Dr. Carroway gave a slight nod. "I came early to check on Lady Montgomery's heart condition. I was in the greenhouse when I heard voices in the secret garden. I never intended to eavesdrop, but when I heard Thomas Carmichael's name—" "You have a personal interest in the Carmichael family," Miss Marple suggested. "Thomas Carmichael was my grandmother's brother," Carroway confirmed. "Few people know that. I changed my name years ago for professional reasons. When I took over Dr. Haydock's practice and discovered Lady Montgomery was a patient, it seemed like fate. You came to St. Mary Mead specifically to investigate your great-uncle's death," Inspector Craddock realized. "Initially, yes. My father always believed Thomas was murdered, but he had no proof. I thought proximity to Lady Montgomery might reveal something." "And it did," Miss Marple said quietly. "Through her medical care, you gained her trust. She suffered from occasional bouts of guilt, talking more freely during examinations than she perhaps realized. I began to piece things together." Peter Carmichael stepped forward angrily. "If you're Thomas Carmichael's great-nephew, that makes us cousins. Why didn't you approach me?" "Because I wasn't certain yet," Carroway replied, "and because you were rather publicly pursuing your own investigation, drawing attention I preferred to avoid. So when you overheard Stevens confronting Lady Montgomery with actual proof," Craddock reasoned, "you decided to silence her before she could confess." "I had no choice," Carroway said, his expression darkening. "My career, my life in St. Mary, Mead, everything would be destroyed by association with a family scandal." "That hardly justifies murder," Craddock replied coldly. "I disagree. Lady Montgomery lived a long, prosperous life built on theft and murder. She didn't deserve a convenient last-minute confession to clear her conscience. And the garden shears? Miss Marple inquired, her voice remarkably steady despite the gun pointed in their direction. An opportunity that presented itself, Carraway admitted. I followed her into the garden after her conversation with Stevens, confronted her with what I knew. When she turned to pick up her shears, I simply acted. And then locked the garden gate behind you, Miss Marple concluded, creating our little puzzle. Precisely. I took her key, locked the gate, and rejoined the party. No one even noticed I'd been gone. Dr. Carraway gestured with the revolver toward Thomas Carmichael's journal. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be taking that evidence and departing. My car is waiting beyond the garden wall. But as he stepped forward to retrieve the journal, a sharp voice rang out from behind him. Drop the gun, Doctor! Miss Simmons stood at the garden gate, holding a small pistol with surprising steadiness. Behind her, Miss Jenkins and Constable Phillips watched with wide eyes. How fitting, Dr. Carraway said with a bitter smile. Original murderess arrives to witness justice for her crime. Justice? Miss Simmons echoed. Is that what you call this? As this tense standoff developed, Miss Marple caught Stephen's eye and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The old gardener understood immediately, shifting his position slightly as Miss Marple continued to engage the doctor in conversation. You know, Dr. Carraway, she said conversationally, in my experience, the most dangerous moment in solving a murder is when the murderer believes they've found the perfect opportunity to escape. Chapter 10. The Truth Among the Roses. For a tense moment, the secret garden became a tableau of conflicting intentions. Dr. Carraway with his revolver trained on the group, Miss Simmons with her small pistol aimed at the doctor, and Stevens poised. Beside the bench, Thomas Carmichael's journal still clutched protectively in his weathered hands. This is quite unnecessary, Miss Marple said calmly, as though discussing the weather rather than a standoff between armed suspects. Surely we can resolve this without further violence. I'm afraid that's impossible, Dr. Carraway replied, his professional demeanour entirely replaced by cold determination. Too much has been revealed. Inspector Craddock, assessing the situation with practised caution, addressed Miss Simmons. Put down your weapon, Miss Simmons. Adding another potential shooting to this affair won't help anyone. I can't do that, Inspector, she replied, her aim unwavering. Not until the doctor does the same. Miss Marple took a small step to her, right, drawing Dr. Carraway's attention. You know, it's rather fascinating how the past and present have converged in this garden. Thomas Carmichael's death in 1935, Lady Montgomery's murder, both tied to roses, secrets, and family legacies. Stay where you are, Miss Marple, Dr. Carraway warned, gesturing with his revolver. Of course, she acquiesced, though she had accomplished her purpose, creating space between herself and Peter Carmichael, who now stood closer to Stevens. What I find most interesting, Miss Marple continued conversationally, is how certain clues were misinterpreted. The duplicate key found in Stevens' cottage, for instance. Initially, it seemed to implicate him in Lady Montgomery's murder, but now we understand it was planted there. By you, Dr. Carraway. A necessary precaution, he acknowledged without remorse. Stevens had to be discredited before he could share what he knew. "And the digitalis?" Inspector Craddock asked, playing along with Miss Marple's strategy of keeping the doctor talking. "From my medical supplies, easily obtained and virtually untraceable in small doses." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "You chose your murder method carefully. A poison associated with heart conditions, knowing Lady Montgomery already had cardiac issues. Quite clever. The garden shears were impulsive," Dr. Carraway admitted with a clinical detachment that was more chilling than any display of emotion might have been. "But effective. And then you locked the garden gate behind you," Miss Marple continued, "creating our central puzzle, how the murderer entered and exited a locked garden. You took Lady Montgomery's key from her pocket after the murder. It was simple enough. During the initial confusion after the body was discovered, I slipped the key back into her pocket. No one noticed." While this exchange continued, Peter Carmichael had been inching closer to Stevens. Inspector Craddock, noting this movement, kept his expression neutral to avoid alerting Dr. Carraway. "There's one thing I still don't understand," Miss Marple said, her gentle voice masking the strategic purpose of her questioning. "The rose placed on Thomas Carmichael's grave, a cutting from the Queen Elizabeth variety. Was that your doing?" A flicker of confusion crossed Dr. Carraway's face. "I placed no rose on any grave. Why would I call attention to Thomas Carmichael?" "I put it there," Stevens said suddenly. "The morning after Lady Montgomery died. It seemed fitting, connecting the two crimes across the decades." Miss Simmons, her pistol still trained on Dr. Carraway, spoke up. I saw you in the churchyard, Stevens. I thought you might be the killer, honouring your victim." "A reasonable assumption," Miss Marple acknowledged. "Just as many of us assumed the anonymous threatening letters came from Peter Carmichael, or possibly Stevens, but they didn't, did they, Dr. Carraway?" The doctor's expression hardened. "My initial approach. I wanted to unsettle Lady Montgomery, make her fearful before I revealed myself." "A psychological attack before the physical one," Inspector Craddock observed grimly. "Enough of this," Dr. Carraway said abruptly, his patience visibly thinning. "Stevens, place the journal on the ground and step back. Everyone else, move toward the rose beds, slowly." But Miss Marple wasn't quite finished. "There's one more thing that puzzles me," she said, as though reluctant to comply until her curiosity was satisfied. "The morning Lady Montgomery died, you claimed to have been with patients. Yet Emily at the post office saw you driving away from Primrose Hall looking agitated." Dr. Carraway's composure faltered slightly. "A minor oversight in my statement." "Not so minor," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You see, it places you at Primrose Hall when Stevens confronted Lady Montgomery, exactly when you claimed to have overheard their conversation." "What difference does the precise timing make?" Dr. Carraway asked impatiently. "I've already admitted to the murder." "It makes all the difference," Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes suddenly sharp with certainty, "because I believe you didn't merely overhear their conversation by chance. You were already monitoring Lady Montgomery's movements, waiting for an opportunity. An opportunity that Stevens inadvertently provided," Inspector Craddock realized. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed, "which suggests a degree of premeditation beyond what you've admitted." Dr. Carraway's expression darkened. "As I said, I came to St. Mary Meads specifically to investigate Thomas Carmichael's death. When my suspicions about Lady Montgomery were confirmed, certain decisions became necessary. Not decisions, Miss Simmons countered bitterly. Murder, just as it was murder in 1935. This exchange had accomplished its purpose, distracting Dr. Carraway long enough for Peter Carmichael to position himself strategically beside Stevens. With a quick nod from Inspector Craddock, Peter suddenly lunged forward, shoving Stevens to safety, while simultaneously hurling a heavy stone planter toward Dr. Carraway. The doctor fired instinctively, but his shot went wide as the planter struck his arm. Inspector Craddock seized the moment, tackling him to the ground. The revolver skittered across the garden path. "Don't move!" Miss Simmons commanded, her pistol still trained on the struggling men. Constable Phillips, recovered enough to assist, rushed forward to help restrain Dr. Carraway. Within moments the doctor was subdued, his wrists secured with handcuffs. "Edwin Carraway," Inspector Craddock said formally, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Lady Amelia Montgomery." As Dr. Carraway was led away, the tension in the secret garden gradually dissipated. Miss Simmons lowered her pistol, her hand trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "I should be arrested too," she said quietly to Inspector Craddock, "for my part in Thomas Carmichael's death." Craddock regarded her thoughtfully. "That's a matter that will require further investigation. A crime nearly 50 years old presents certain challenges for prosecution." "Nevertheless," Miss Simmons insisted, "I need to face whatever consequences remain. I've lived with this guilt too long." Peter Carmichael, who had been examining the journal recovered from Stevens, looked up with a conflicted expression. "This contains my grandfather's detailed account of his poisoning, along with his rose-breeding notes. Everything he suspected about Lady Montgomery and Miss Simmons is recorded here." "And what will you do with it?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Peter hesitated, glancing from the journal to Miss Simmons. "I'm not sure. Justice for my grandfather is one thing, but after 50 years... Stevens, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Your grandfather valued truth above all, Mr. Carmichael, but he also believed in forgiveness. He wrote as much in those final pages." Surprised, Peter turned to the end of the journal, finding the passage Stevens referenced. His expression softened as he read his grandfather's words. "He knew he was dying," Peter said quietly, "yet he wrote about hoping those responsible would find peace and redemption." Miss Jenkins, who had been watching from the garden gate, approached Peter hesitantly. "What will happen now to Primrose Hall and the roses?" "I suppose that depends on Lady Montgomery's final will," Peter replied, looking to Miss Simmons. "She did change it the morning before her death," the solicitor confirmed. "As she promised Stevens she would. The estate is divided, half to you, Peter, and half to the Royal Horticultural Society, with one condition." "Which is?" Peter asked. "That Thomas Carmichael's contribution to the Montgomery glory and all subsequent varieties be publicly acknowledged. She wanted the truth known, even if it damaged her reputation posthumously." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. A final act of atonement. As they prepared to leave the secret garden, Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple with newfound respect. "You suspected Dr. Carraway from quite early on, didn't you?" "I had my doubts about several people," she replied modestly, "but certain details stood out. His reaction to the body, his convenient arrival in the village just months before. his frequent evening visits to Primrose Hall that went beyond normal medical attention. And then there was the matter of the garden gate, the locked garden puzzle. Craddock acknowledged. Yes, only someone with medical knowledge would have both access to Digitalis and understanding of how to use it. And only someone, Lady Montgomery, trusted would be able to approach her in the secret garden without raising her suspicions. Dr. Carroway satisfied both requirements. As they passed through the wrought iron gate, Miss Marple paused to look back at the garden that had held so many secrets across the decades. The morning sun now illuminated the prized roses in all their glory, beautiful and thorny, much like the truth they had finally uncovered. Chapter 11. All is revealed. Week after the dramatic events in the secret garden, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden, enjoying afternoon tea with Mrs. Bantry and Reverend Hawthorne. The summer flowers were in full bloom, creating a colourful backdrop to their conversation about the case that had so thoroughly disrupted the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. "I still can't quite believe it was Dr. Carroway," Mrs. Bantry said, helping herself to a cucumber sandwich. "He seemed so kind and professional." "The most effective disguise of all," Miss Marple observed. "His position as village doctor gave him the perfect cover for his true purpose in coming to St. Mary Mead." "And that purpose was revenge?" "Reverend?" Hawthorne asked, stirring sugar into his tea. "Not precisely revenge," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Self-preservation primarily. Dr. Carroway, or Edwin Carmichael, to use his birth name, had established a respectable life and career. The public revelation of his connection to a scandalous family history would have undermined everything he'd built." "But why kill Lady Montgomery?" Mrs. Bantry pressed. "Surely after 50 years, the death of Thomas Carmichael would be of little interest to anyone outside the family." "That's where the roses enter the picture," Miss Marple explained. Lady Montgomery's reputation as a pioneering rose breeder was built upon her brother's work. The Montgomery glory, which launched her career, was actually Thomas Carmichael's discovery. If that truth became public knowledge, especially with her new Queen Elizabeth variety about to be registered, the scandal would have been considerable. "And Dr. Carroway feared being associated with this scandal?" the Reverend asked sceptically. "He feared more than association," Miss Marple said. "You see, Dr. Carroway had a rather significant gambling problem in his past, something he'd worked very hard to overcome and conceal. Inspector Craddock discovered this during his investigation. A public scandal connecting him to the Carmichael-Montgomery affair might have prompted closer scrutiny of his own history, potentially ruining his fresh start in St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "But how did he know Lady Montgomery was going to confess everything? That seems terribly coincidental." "Not coincidental at all," Miss Marple replied. "Dr. Carroway had been systematically investigating his great-uncle's death since arriving in the village. His position as Lady Montgomery's physician gave him unique access. During her medical consultations, particularly as her heart condition worsened, she became more reflective, more troubled by her past. He recognized her growing guilt and realized she might eventually confess. So he began sending those threatening letters," Reverend Hawthorne surmised. "Precisely. To test her reactions, to see how close she might be to revealing everything. When Stevens confronted her with Thomas Carmichael's hidden journal, It forced her hand. She promised to confess publicly at the garden party, something Dr. Carraway overheard and could not allow to happen. The garden gate opened, admitting Inspector Craddock and Peter Carmichael, who had been invited to join them for the afternoon. Miss Marple, the inspector greeted her with genuine respect. Regaling your friends with the solution to our mystery, I see. Merely filling in a few details, she replied modestly. Please, join us. How are matters progressing with the case? Dr. Carraway has been formally charged, Craddock reported, accepting a cup of tea. He's made a full confession, though his solicitor will likely pursue a diminished responsibility defense based on his family connection to the victim. And Miss Simmons? Miss Marple inquired. A more complicated situation, Craddock admitted. The Crown Prosecution Service is still deciding whether to proceed with charges related to Thomas Carmichael's death. Given the time elapsed and her cooperation, they may opt for leniency. Peter Carmichael, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. I've asked them not to pursue charges against her. My grandfather's journal suggests he had forgiven those involved, even as he recorded their actions. I think he would want the same from me. Miss Marple smiled approvingly. A generous decision, Mr. Carmichael. Not entirely selfless, he admitted. Miss Simmons has agreed to help document the full history of my grandfather's work. We're planning a comprehensive publication that will finally give him the recognition he deserves. And what of Stevens? Mrs. Bantry asked. Poor man, suspected of murder when he was only trying to uncover the truth. He's staying on at Primrose Hall, Peter replied. He knows those gardens better than anyone, and will need his expertise as we move forward with the Queen Elizabeth Rose registration, with proper attribution to both my grandfather and Lady Montgomery. And Miss Jenkins? Reverend Hawthorne inquired. I understand she was once acquainted with you, Mr. Carmichael. Peter's expression softened. Flora has agreed to help manage Primrose Hall, while I divide my time between there and my work in Sure-Un, London. Our past relationship was complicated, but I believe we've found a new understanding. The Horticultural Society is quite excited about the partnership, Inspector Craddock added. They see it as a chance to preserve Lady Montgomery's legitimate contributions while acknowledging Thomas Carmichael's foundational work. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A fitting resolution to decades of secrecy and misattribution. There's one thing I still don't quite understand, Mrs. Bantry said. How did you solve the puzzle of the locked garden gate, Jane? That seemed the most perplexing aspect of the whole affair. Actually, that was what first alerted me to the likelihood of a trusted individual being the murderer, Miss Marple explained. You see, Lady Montgomery was found with her garden key still in her pocket, yet the gate was ajar when we discovered her body. This suggested someone who could approach her without raising suspicions, kill her, take her key to lock the garden behind them, and then return the key to her pocket during the initial confusion after the body was found. Dr. Carraway, Inspector Craddock confirmed. As her physician, he was one of the first to examine the body. Precisely. Few people would have had that combination of opportunity, access, and medical knowledge. The garden gate puzzle narrowed our suspect pool considerably. And the duplicate key found in Stephen's cottage? Reverend Hawthorne asked. Planted by Dr. Carraway to direct suspicion away from himself, Miss Marple replied. A rather common tactic among murderers, creating evidence to implicate someone else. The perfect crime, Mrs. Bantry mused. Or it would have been if not for you, Jane. Miss Marple demurred with characteristic modesty. Human nature is remarkably consistent. You know, people may believe they're being clever or original, but patterns of behaviour repeat themselves. I've observed similar situations in the village over the years. Nothing so dramatic as murder, of course, but the same underlying motivations. Fear of exposure, protection of reputation, desperate attempts to conceal the past. As afternoon drifted toward evening, the conversation turned to the future of Primrose Hall and its famous gardens. Peter spoke enthusiastically about his plans to honour both his grandfather's legacy and the genuine horticultural advances Lady Montgomery had made in her later years. "The roses will continue to bloom," he said, "but now with honest attribution and a clear lineage." When the visitors had departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, contemplating the case that had just concluded. The parallels between gardening and detective work struck her as particularly apt. Both required patient observation, an understanding of underlying patterns, and the ability to distinguish between what merely appeared to be true and what actually was. Like the puzzle of the locked garden gate, many mysteries seemed impenetrable, until one found the right key. Not always a physical key, but often the crucial insight that unlocked everything else. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers in her garden, carrying the sweet scent of roses. Miss Marple smiled contentedly. Another mystery solved, another set of truths brought to light after decades of concealment. In St. Mary Mead, as in gardens everywhere, what was buried did not always stay hidden forever. The natural order had been restored, justice served, secrets revealed, and lessons learned, until the next time something unexpected disturbed the peaceful rhythm of village life. Miss Jane Marple would continue tending her garden, observing human nature, and knitting together the threads of everyday existence into patterns that revealed the truth behind even the most perplexing of puzzles.